Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do yet another video on racism, because communicating is difficult. If the Son of God could come into this world and not be understood, and I'm working on the Sermon on the Mount for my Sunday sermons, as some of you know, if the most famous sermon in the world has not achieved consensus among thousands and thousands of interpreters, and there are multiple major schools on how to understand the Sermon on the Mount, why should I assume communication would be easy? So I want to talk about racism. I want to talk about what I've learned about racism in my last 2-3 years of making YouTube videos about Jordan Peterson, thinking about cognitive science, thinking more deeply about how human beings work and why racism is a perennial problem, why it's not going away, and what I think can be done about it at its roots. So a little bit about me. I grew up in a household deeply committed to what I call second wave anti-racism, which is very much arose in the 60s and 70s, and the idea was live integration. And so my father pastored a church which was intentionally made up of people, of black folks and white folks, of rich folks and poor folks. I lived in the community. We did life together. This was the context in which I grew up. I didn't know anything different for the first number of years of my life. We lived and breathed this. We are family members, as it were. Our church family members were black folks and white folks, and we did this intentionally so we could know each other and practice loving each other in the midst of the racial strife going on in the 60s and 70s. And for both the white members of the church and the black members of the church, this church was an alternative. There are plenty of black congregations in the neighborhood that were similar to what many of the black Christians grew up in. There were plenty of CRCs in the community that many of the Dutch white people could have gone to, but they went to this church to build face-to-face relationships of trust, hope, and accountability with each other, and to live this way for decades. My father pastored this church for 36 years. I spent the first 18 years of my life going there, and when I went to Grand Rapids, Michigan, I went to another church that was just like it. In college and seminary, I was very interested in the divestment movement to topple apartheid in South Africa, and there were some particular connections between the Dutch Reformed Church in North America and that in South Africa. And so that was a very big deal at Calvin College when I was there. I toured the Nicaraguan Revolution. At that point, during the Sandinista Revolution, when they were in charge, they were having tour groups. You could come down and tour the revolution, and I toured the revolution. I could make whole videos about what I learned on that tour. I was excited to read Liberation Theology, and I read it with gusto. In fact, I read it to such a degree that when I had my ministerial examination for candidacy in the Christian Reformed Church, or for licensure, the board of trustees was somehow tipped off that you'd better watch that aspect with this guy, and asked me pointed questions about liberation theology. Okay? After that, I went and I served overseas in the Dominican Republic with Haitians who were living there in a rather undocumented fashion. It doesn't map on exactly to the experience of Latin Americans or illegal or undocumented immigrants from other places in the world to the United States, but there's a degree of overlap. Part of what was particular to the Dominican Republic was that many of these Haitians worked in the government-owned sugarcane industry. And these Haitians did not have much of any legal documentation, but then again, the competence of the Dominican government in just about any level was suspect. And so with that level of incompetence and corruptions, it's doubtful to the degree that a government program would be helpful to the Haitians. It was very particular. I worked with these Haitians, and there were racial tensions in the Dominican Republic. Again, it's not fully mappable on the United States because their histories were different. I did religious training and community development work with some of the poorest people in the Western Hemisphere. And I did that for 7 years of my life after seminary. After that, I came to Sacramento, California, where I continue to minister in a church that in many ways continues to live out that second wave anti-racist vision of face-to-face relationships. Now in Sacramento, California, unlike Paterson, New Jersey, where at least to some degree, it wasn't really, some degree the focus was on black-white, the great migration up from the south. You can read about in Warmth of Other Suns, a really wonderful book. In Sacramento, California, in the neighborhood in which I minister, there is no ethnic majority. There are white folks, there are Hispanic folks, there are black folks, there are a variety of Asian cultures, there are Pacific Island people's cultures, there's Vietnamese, there's Hmong, there's a significant historical Chinese community in this area. There's a significant Japanese community in this area. There's a Korean community in this area. And for those of you who don't know it, the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans don't always get along. And the Asian communities don't always get along with the other communities. And Sacramento had a reputation, at least at the beginning of the 21st century, of being the most integrated city in America. Time magazine wrote about that in a 2003 article, and they focused on the community in which my church is at. So I have lived my entire life dealing with issues of race and poverty from the time I was born until the present day. This is the context out of which I speak. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, it is tremendously important to understand what Scott Alexander points out in his really excellent article against murderism, that there are three commonly assumed implicit definitions of racism that are being used and not distinguished. Now, personally, I don't find any of these commonly assumed implicit definitions of racism to be terribly helpful. I got a number of comments after my last video about the definition of racism. Racism is a tremendously difficult thing to define, or I should better say, to agree on a definition for. And that is in fact the point of this Against Murderism article by Scott Alexander in Slate Star Codex. Racism is about as fudgy a word as you can find. It is still applicable. Racism is very much a thing, but it is a very difficult word to define. And we have many of these words to define. Now, some of you will say racism is easy to define. Fine, you have a definition that's clear in your mind. That definition may be clear in your mind, but if it's not clear in the people who have ears that listen to you, when you use the word, it will be understood in multiple ways. Now, the three common ways that Scott Alexander delineates and basically demonstrates that none of these three definitions of racism actually work well in the world are motivational racism. Someone has a specific, explicit, overt, conscious bias against another group of people based on race. You see, even race as a term itself is plenty fudgy. Is race, or are we talking about culture? YouTube search Denzel Washington race culture. Denzel Washington is very much correct. Many of the conversations we're having have to do with culture more than genetics. Brett Weinstein is correct. Human beings have these two tracks. But for one reason or another, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the video, such and such a person has some animus, some animosity against a group of people based on racial characteristics, usually within a specific frame. I have known people that have been explicitly, overtly racist, and will tell you that to their face, who actually have many friends of other races and they're on good terms with them. You will find this more often than not in the Old South in the United States, where these practices go back and have connections with slave time. And if you read The Warmth of Other Suns, I read that book on Kindle. I know we have a copy in the church library. In my opinion, this is an outstanding book if you want to up the resolution on the particularities of the shapes of different communities, different African American communities, and their experience in the United States. This is a wonderful winner of the National Book Award. A tremendous book. And I read this book just a few years ago, and in many ways I basically began to understand the context in which I grew up. Now, one of the things that happened in the Great Migration is that folks coming from the Deep South, the Jim Crow South, came to other places in the United States and discovered that racism was different. Okay? And whereas in the South, people could be explicitly racist, in the North and West, people were more implicitly racist. But again, what kind of racism? Racism of motives, just having a conscious, overt animosity against people of a different racial group, however that's defined. Definition of belief, harboring certain ideas, I call this propositional racism, about members of other groups. And definition of consequence, or consequential racism. These are different outcomes, and therefore calling that racism. And if you listen carefully to all of the conversations going about racism, if you keep these three categories in mind, you will better understand what people are saying, and you will better understand when people are switching categories. For example, here's a situation of consequential racism where there's an unequal outcome based on race, and then people asserting motivational racism as the cause of that. If you keep these three ideas, and again, Scott Alexander goes through these things quite nicely in his blog post. Now, getting into these definitions, and I got some comments on my last video about that. People have their own definition of racism or perceiving racism, which they apply. And when another one is applied, they say, that's not racism. Okay, fair enough. But if you want to have a conversation with someone else, it's not only important to assert the definition of your word, it's also important to understand the definition of your word and to ask the other party to clarify the definition of their word. And in fact, you may be able to have a productive conversation just trying to come to terms with the competing definitions of both words. Now, with the Scott Adams thing, a lot of the back and forth is about whether a law is, let's say, colorblind. Most colorblind legislation has been gotten out of the American Code and policies in many places. The most non-colorblind legislation we have tends to be third wave anti-racist legislation that is trying to address economic or historical inequalities between groups, and so they are overtly selecting for race in particular ways. And you can look at the Harvard affirmative action legislation and controversy that's going on through that. Does the law or policy yield or contribute to observable racial inequality? This is a question of consequential racism. And then in that last video, which can systems have motive? Well, do human beings have motives? are the motives that we human beings have actually systemic? Is there any other motivation that is non-systemic? And be careful with how you answer that, because, quite frankly, if you're a naturalist materialist, you're asserting that all human, at least certain kinds of naturalist materialists, that all human motivations are in fact systemic, because the systems are beneath the human being. And what principalities are in a sense like Uncle Sam. Can we talk about the motives of Uncle Sam? This is where that conversation goes, but I don't want that video to be about this. A big deal right now in the current fervor over in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing is the question of what can we accomplish? And I don't think anyone has talked about this with more clarity and perception than John McWhorter when he talks about the current status of the race conversation in America today. This is a video that I've pointed people to often on social media. It feels good to be a victim with Glenn Loury and John McWhorter on the Glenn Show, and I'm happy to see that their videos are getting quite a bit more traction now. This video started out with Glenn Loury speaking with passion about the painful situation in Black American communities today. And what he said about that, I agree with. It's a disaster. And much of my life has been spent on the front lines of this disaster. Answering the question what to do about it is harder still. But the current tactic by many seems to be America has to come to terms with racism. Okay, what will that look like?
Before, I quietly turned down most offers. I no longer speak live about race at all, except when it involves Glenn, despite the money that I could make doing it. And it is because of a certain stalemate in the dialogue that I see. And I'm not sure that we can quite get past it. And it's based on really just two things. It's not complex. It's actually rather simple. It's two log jams that make it impossible to have an honest conversation about race in this country right now. And I've decided to sit out the debate for about 5 years until...
Now, this was a few years ago, and he's been more active in the debate. And if you follow he and Glenn on the Glenn Show, you can hear them talk quite regularly about this. So this was a couple of years ago.
Fashions change. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm talking around the fact that, as Glenn was referring to, the idea that freshmen are now given Ta-Nehisi Coates' book to read, to me, basically just stops the race debate in its tracks. If it's going to be like that, then I'm not in it until some time passes. This is what I mean. There are two problems. One is a white problem. One is a black problem. I'm going to do the white one first. It has become a matter of religious faith among educated white people in America to feel a sense of atonement for being racist. When I say that it's religious, I don't mean that as a kind of trash talk. I don't mean that as a way of getting attention. I mean that it has become a matter of what any anthropologist who had no pre-existent biases would identify as a religious faith. We don't use the word religion, but it is a faith. And that is the idea that, for example, I'm going to use a phrase that we're all so used to, but really break it down. America needs to come to terms with racism. Okay. What terms? What does that mean? Come to terms. What would the situation be if America came to those terms? Let's imagine the America that we're all about to walk back into after this seminar. This is an America where America has come to terms. What? Is it about something that would be written? Is it about conversations that would be had. What are the terms? One imagines a certain musical soundtrack, but that's a movie. What are the terms? It has no meaning at all that America would come to terms. Does it mean reparations for slavery? Because we've talked about that and nothing comes of it, and yet we keep talking about the coming to terms. It means nothing. What it means is that educated whites now consider it a mark of being morally advanced to acknowledge their inner racists.
Right there. This is, in many ways, much of the talk, well-intended, earnest, sincere. People are really trying to do the right thing, but so much of it is, this is a mark of their moral superiority.
And the idea is that at some point, America will come to terms with that racism. But what are the terms? That has no meaning except as an analogy to Christian theological conceptions. It's about a judgment day. It's about this time when all of a sudden something happens where white people are absolved of their inner racism, and then we move on.
And right about Judgment Day. Lord, did I not march in the parade? Did I not say all the carefully chosen proper words so that I don't lose status amongst the rest of my peers? But now, of course, there's two sides. So now, if you use the wrong words, you're going to hear from the other side, and back and forth and back and forth. So now we have holy words on both sides, and how dare you break from your tribe by using the wrong set of words?
But obviously, in terms of the lives that we're leading, walking around with our bottles of water, that has no meaning at all. And so, that's not activism. To be a white person and to think, I am racist, I have white privilege, I'm going to acknowledge this all the time, does nothing for the black people that Glenn was just talking about. It's something that's inwardly directed. It's very humane, it's well-intended, but it has nothing to do with anything that Dr. King was talking about. It has nothing to do with anything that the civil rights movement was about. It's an inwardly turned and, frankly, idle matter.
And that's exactly right. It's idle, I-D-L-E. And when it gets up enough steam, it becomes an IDOL.
I have not written about this because I think it would be mean to the people who convene Aspen. But I'll say it here, that I was at Aspen in 2017, and various things were discussed at Aspen. It was a very smart event. All sorts of brilliance was going on at Aspen. But, of course, at one point in the middle, there was this event that was about racism in the 21st century. Okay, so racism in the 21st century. Now, the question would be, given all the other events, what were we going to learn at this event? What was the new thing? But there was nothing to learn. I went to this thinking to myself, I shouldn't go, but I'm black and I'm at Aspen and there aren't that many black people. I should go. And I'm going to learn about, the racism here at Aspen. So I went. The food was spectacular. Now, it was run by one of my favorite black commentators. I'm not going to name who she was, but I really wish they had not wasted her time doing this. And there were 3 panelists. And everybody who was black at Aspen went to it, and a lot of the white people as well. This event had no substance whatsoever. It was church. It was literally church.
Now, that's a pretty stark condemnation of church, but I know what he's talking about.
No one would have used the word church, but there was this church service in the
Now that might change now in 2020.
middle of Aspen. So, an eminent black foundation director, who I will not name, talked about how when he was coming up in the business, he would not wear casual clothes on Casual Friday where he worked because he thought that it wouldn't be good for a black person to do that. And everybody clapped. That was considered very funny. Then a middle-aged, I know I'm middle-aged too, a middle-aged white man talked about how he has a coach to teach him about white privilege every week. Somebody comes to his house every week and teaches him that he's privileged as a white person, and everybody clapped. In other words, he has a pastor. And then everybody left, and everybody talked about how wonderful this event had been. Nobody learned anything. That event served for white people at Aspen to atone for being racist, and everybody went off and actually learned things.
To temporarily atone, because they're going to need to make atonement regularly. Okay?
It was a church service. That is the way things are now. Every third story on Slate is a church service. Every third story at NPR is a church service. It really doesn't help anything to acknowledge that racism is something more abstract than cross burnings on lawns is one thing.
More abstract. It's something that's exactly right.
To walk around thinking of it as a permanent stain that you must always atone for and never really will until America, quote unquote, comes to terms with racism is fiction. It is something as benighted and idle as something that we might see in an unlettered tribe and find curious. That is the white problem. Black problem.
I'll save you the black problem. Watch the whole video. The whole conversation is outstanding. So I wanted to make a video about what racism is, why it develops, why it's perpetuated, why it gets weaponized in systems, and how to address it. So this could be my anti-racism video, if you want my version of it. I learned a lot about cognitive science, psychology from Jordan Peterson. In the Roger Scruton conversation, Jordan Peterson made the point that we see low-resolution cartoons. Why? Well, cognitive science has borne this out. The world, and if you listen to the point that Jordan Peterson was trying to make to Sam Harris in his conversations with him, it's exactly this point, not about racism, but a larger picture about human behavior. The world is too massive for our little brains to take in. Okay? So the world is too massive. So the question is, how do human beings filter and process the world in order to manage it productively? And you can find Don Hoffman conversations, tricks, and hacks, all of these things. We have to do something to manage to simplify the world, to filter the world so that we can manage it. And the point Jordan Peterson was making to Sam Harris is that these filters have been developing for a very, very long time. And those of us today are heirs of the development of these filters. Those are all systems, as it were. And if you listen to Brett Weinstein, these are cultural systems. So not only genetic systems, it's hardware and it's software. And without these systems, we could not manage the world. Okay? We have developed tricks and filters to process this massive world individually and communally, because human beings require community and we filter the world through each other. That's why we're always talking. That's why we're always talking about these things. That's why the whole point of Jordan Peterson's bucko keeps getting deflated. The whole point of Jordan Peterson's program is that these things get built into our emotional world. They get built into our emotional life, and they're built into our communal world. This is what it means to be a human being, and human beings are the most successful species on the planet, capable of processing this world at a higher level than any other species. My dog's filters are far limited. The chimpanzee's filters are far limited. And so it has to do with us as individuals, and it has to do with us working in community. If you don't understand this point, understanding why racism has developed will be difficult for you. Okay? Jordan Peterson, 2017 personality course. First, we see meaning. Before we see an object, an item, someone might pull a gun. Before you see the gun, you see the meaning of the gun. Your brain is wired that way. Why? Because the meaning of the gun is more important than the details of the gun. You see a low-resolution cartoon of the gun and you respond. This is part of what goes on in when people get into confrontations and guns come out. Our minds take over in order to keep us safe. All right? This is how we work. First, we see meanings. We don't see objects for a while. And when we start seeing objects, we see them at low resolution. Now, again, you might say, well, how would I see the meaning of the gun before I see the object of the gun? Watch Jordan Peterson's 2017 Personality 12 about phenomenology, Heidegger, Binswanger, and Boss. This is cognitive science. This is what scientists are telling you. You see the meaning before you see the object. And a big part of that meaning is broken down into very low resolution opportunity, threat. Okay? And our minds are always doing this. And if you follow your perceptions closely, you will recognize that your attention is drawn to something. Your mind has already seen it, and it only comes into your conscious higher resolution format after your mind has already processed meaning, opportunity, and threat. All right? Those things are dominant. The resolution gets upped as we go. And this is, in fact, even built into our eyesight. Only the very center of our eyesight sees high resolution. The resolution gets poorer after that. Now you might say, but I'm sitting in the room, looking at the room. Yes, it's a trick your mind is playing. Your eyes are always darting, and the technology in your brain is managing this pre-consciously. Okay? Now again, this is vital to understand why racism is the way it is. We tag these threats and opportunities communally, all right? And we tag them on low-resolution cartoon images. And so why is it when you take that cucumber and you put it by the cat jumps and we laugh? Why? We know it's a cucumber. What did the filter in the cat's brain see? It triggered snake. Scientists have done studies on chimps raised in captivity that have never in their life seen a snake. When that snake is introduced into the chimp's eyesight, the chimp reacts, even if it's never seen a snake. That system was built into the chimpanzee. The chimp community will respond to it. Now again, there's a hardware and a software layer here. What this means is that communities develop biases within them that are passed on in the cultural layer. Are you going to call this a system? What else will you call it? We form biases as individuals before we are born. Unborn infants already prefer their parents' voices. Unborn infants are already starting to put together the building blocks of language by listening to their father and their mother and even the music their parents are listening to. Why do we form biases? Biases are part of this low-resolution cartoon meaning first mechanism that we have. Human beings cannot live without biases. Biases are fundamental for the reducing the overly complex world into a manageable entity that we can deal with. These systems go through history. Newborn infants prefer their parents' smells. Quickly many other sensory factors associated with need and pleasure. I just talked. Why is it you have, last night I was playing a computer game with my son and I put on headphones and I listened to music from the 70s. Why does that music from the 70s move me so much? I've been formed according to that. And it's not even the specific songs, it's the style of music. Well, what's the style of the music? The style of the music is a low-level abstraction that has been built into me. We cannot live without biases, okay? They are formed in us automatically for our good because the world is too large and complex for us to manage it. Skin color will be a part of the package along with innumerable other qualities. Now, if everyone in your community has a certain skin color, when you first see someone of another skin color, especially if this comes later and later in life, or all the contexts with which you see the other people in that skin color will imprint biases on you. It is inescapable. It is part of us managing this world. All of these biases are going to be low resolution. Some of these biases are going to be more accurate than others. You will have these biases, and skin color is often a package. What are other elements of the package? Smell, food, clothing, behavior. We're watching each other all the time. I grew up in a context in which it was, I remember, I can't give you the date. I remember as a kid, I've always been information hungry. So I watched the news. I remember the first time I understood when someone made the comment, Black Americans are a minority in this country. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. Why? Because when and where I grew up, it was obvious most of the people in America were black. Where did I form that bias? Because of when and where I grew up. I taught day camp to the children in the neighborhood of the church who were overwhelmingly black. There was always a white kid or two, a Puerto Rican kid, somebody that had a white mother and a black father. Those kids were always around, but it was overwhelmingly black. When I would go to the bathroom, serving as a day camp counselor, I would take the kids to the bathroom and I would use the bathroom, and the kids would lean over because they wanted to see if the white was all over. And when I'd sit down, many of the kids I had more hair then, would put their fingers through my hair because here was an opportunity that they had to get to know a white person up close. What was he like? They had biases. I had biases. We all received packages. There were good things and bad things in those packages. Those good things and bad things came to us through our systems, biological systems, system after system after system after system. What happens? Human beings cooperate in order to compete. We judge each other even before we know we are judging each other. All these stories of people, of white people getting nervous around black people and black people getting nervous around cops, these are biases that have developed, rightly or wrongly, but they are low resolution cartoon images of each other, and we respond to them. Just for those of you listening, like this little cartoon I put on where there's a black woman saying to a white man, little low resolution cartoon image, "You've never been judged by your skin color." And the white guy says, "Just was." Point made. We all judge each other according to innumerable low resolution signals that we receive from the world. And we see these signals before we see the people. When I visit Whitensville, Massachusetts, with my mother, and walk around with my mother, people call me Stan. Why? I'm the same height as my father. I've got less hair. I'm the same skin color as my father. I'm associated with my mother. I look like him to a degree. I sound like him. I walk like him. Before they see me, they see the low resolution image of my father. It takes time for the resolution to get sharper. These are the biases that are built into us. And there are innumerable ones. And these are not things that we have taken in volitionally. They are part of being a human being, and they are inescapable. We need them to live. We quickly learn that there are not only individual rivalries and low-resolution cartoon images, but communal rivalries. Our tribes are malleable according to threats and opportunities. And if you live with high resolution and some cognizance of these issues, you will notice that people are enormously inconsistent because it requires a lot of variability. After 9/11, a lot of black folks said, white folks are treating us better. Why? Because black folks were safer than their low resolution images of, another low resolution word, Arab folks. And they would often confuse. They'd see, let's say, a Sikh who has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia, a Sikh with a head covering, and they'd say Arab. And the Sikh is like, your world is so small. Do you know how large the world is there in the Near East, the subcontinent, and all that population and all those people groups and all those histories, but Americans with low resolution? And again, the fact that you don't know much is simply a product of the experiences that you've had. This is what it's like to be a human being. Now, violence is a common and natural, in scare quotes, elements of competition. And we're seeing that played out now. And again, when you see a gun, you don't see the gun. You see the meaning of the gun before you see the gun. When you see these low-resolution images, what's the difference between Hands Across America? Remember that? Remember the Coke commercial? I'd like to teach the world to sing, all different colors lined up hand to hand, and a whole wall of people with helmets on, shields, and sticks. What's the meaning difference between those lines of people? You see meaning, threats and opportunities, before you see almost anything else. Now, we travel through time with our tribes. We grow up with a culture. We grow up with we grow up with genetics, and this stuff is built into our genetics. And you can see that again from the chimps raised in captivity being afraid of snakes, because the time gets imprinted into us. This is why, again, I've used this illustration before, we don't have large round bellies like chimpanzees, because we cook food, and we don't need all those digestions, okay? We will continue to reinforce those tribal bounds through time as we compete with other tribes through time. And these things line up in a hierarchy, all right? The potential for differentiating aspects and flexible alliances are nearly innumerable. Just watch movies. Movies are archetypal stories written up for popular consumptions, and they both express biases and shape biases. Notice the Klingons in the first Star Trek all were sort of Soviets. And this is what we do in movies all the time. and our alliances get flexible. And that's, again, why after 9/11, many African Americans said white people are treating us better because we're not Arabs. This is how we move. Skin color in America. Skin color is one of these low resolution tags. And what we do is we attribute other things that, in a very low resolution way, in a very imperfect way, but accurate enough to correlate with certain things. And why did slavery get racialized in the American colonies in the ways that it did? Read the book 1493. It lays it out quite well. Explorers from the old world unwittingly brought malaria and their host mosquitoes to the new world. They hitched a ride along with earthworms and a great many other things. One of the things they discovered in the new world that wasn't in the old world was tobacco. And tobacco went through the world like a novel coronavirus. And at first, those southern colonies were really struggling. When tobacco became the drug of choice, the novel drug of choice for a world, well, they couldn't grow enough of it. In fact, the government tried to demand that the farmers grow food because there was just so much money in growing tobacco. How was tobacco tended? It's a fairly labor-intensive crop. Well, they had European white indentured servants. Well, what happened? What is the Mason-Dixon line? Well, the Mason-Dixon line developed. Why? Because for the most part, what the Mason-Dixon line delineated was the extent to which malaria could travel north, which also had a low-resolution correspondence to places you could really productively grow tobacco. And as the story is told, a slave ship, they were using slaves in other parts of the Americas, came through and discovered, well, you know what? The slaves don't die like the Europeans die. Did they know anything about mosquitoes carrying malaria? No. Did they know anything about malaria? No. Tertian fever. Again, read the book. Slavery, skin color became a way. They didn't know anything about malaria. They didn't know anything about mosquitoes. It became a low resolution way for them to figure out who could live in the now malarial southern reaches of the United States where tobacco was growing. And at some point, someone came up with, is this a racist idea? It's pretty much the definition of racism. Which definition? Let's keep those of African ancestry in bondage in perpetuity, unlike the whites. Now, in the early days, not in this book, but in other books you can read it, it was a fairly fluid system because laws adapt slowly too. And so you had cases where you had people of African descent owning others of African descent. And so, again, the higher the resolution, the more complexity there is. But skin color became a low resolution tag for a whole variety of things in American culture. It got into the cultural system. Now, it got into the cultural system of Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, in a different way. It got into the cultural system of Brazil in a different way. It got into the cultural systems in Europe in a different way, because that's how culture works. Now, here's Charles Murray is about the author of Inconvenient Truths, however you feel about him. And his latest book on human diversity bears this in mind. People are not biologically equal. In fact, the reason we have individuals is because no two people are possibly equal in every aspect, even identical twins that start with the same genetic code and have much the same things going through life. Talk to their parents. Talk to each of them. They're different. Commonalities are also manifest. We have more things in common than we have apart, if we could number them. And that's the sense in which, in our low resolution way, we can identify what a human being is, which is also a cultural category. Nature and nurture through history is like the wheat and the tares. So why is it that people from West Africa had immunity to malaria and Europeans didn't? It took a very long time for those populations to develop that immunity. That same immunity made them susceptible, and this was a word I heard commonly growing up in a black community, sickle cell anemia. Now, a lot of you white folks might have to Google that. Well, my low resolution understanding is that this is a part of the issue with malaria. All right? And so talk to doctors about different medical situations, are black people disposed, the American black population disposed to high blood pressure by virtue of culture or genetics? Well, there's plenty of videos about the genetics of African American people as opposed to genetics of people who are living in Africa. The common genetic profile for African Americans is about 30% European descent, 30-some percent European descent, 60-some percent African descent. And if you go to a place like the Dominican Republic, it will be different there still because of the different history of the island. But we continue to look for low-resolution signals that offer a degree of correlation practical enough to afford some prediction. Remember, you don't see the gun, you see the meaning of the gun. You don't see the ball whizzing toward. I was on a playground in junior high, and a ball came whizzing. I couldn't see it, hit me in the head, and, what hit me? And you stand up, and there's this soccer ball, and some kids were playing, and and who. Suddenly, you want to know who kicked it and why was it intentional. On and on and on and on. That's the way we work. But if you see something coming towards you, and we used to play this game as kids, you flinch. Why do you flinch? You can try really hard not to flinch, and you can, with great determination, steel yourself for it, but you flinch. Why? You see the meaning, opportunity, and threat before you see the thing. And that's why witnesses have all the kinds of problems they have. They caught the meaning, but again, now the meaning itself is also filtered through that system. And so if you were raised in a particular neighborhood, you're going to see a different set of meanings than if you're raised in another neighborhood. That's what it means to be a human being. And I'd get this all the time. People would say, "You're so tall, you must have played basketball in high school." No, I didn't. And I could be greatly offended that they would presume a level of athleticism that I do not possess. But I don't. I might be tall, but I wasn't that good at basketball. Didn't even make the junior high team. Broke my little heart. Got to run the scoreboard, though. Yep, I'm a nerd. Now, part of what I am really disturbed about is a concern that I share with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. The messages that we are sending out now inform those biases in the next generation. And if we are and this is why Jordan Peterson talks about these group dynamics as a really bad game, because we already have to use group dynamics for this. But imagine a population in which was told a convenient lie that they would already be disposed to hear. The reason for your misery? It's the Jews. It's the communists. It's the blacks. It's the whites. It's the men's. It's the straights. It's the gays. When you play that kind of game, when you reinforce those low resolution biases tribally, you set people up. Now again, Brett Weinstein has some really wonderful lectures on this because he makes the point it's harder to do with men and women because, at least for most of our history, you knew both fairly well. It's a far easier and therefore more genocidal and destructive game to play across racial and tribal lines. Because what you're doing is weaponizing the biases of the next generation. And it's bad. And what I am seeing now as a result of the way that the new third wave anti-racism talk, I am seeing more and more young people coming up and saying, why do all white people hate me? I'm white. Yeah, but not you. Do I hate you? No, not you. You're my friend. And see, right here, you have the degree of personalization. But what these people are being told is, well, should African Americans have some extra concern for the police, especially in certain neighborhoods? Absolutely. That's very reasonable. But there's a way of doing this, there's a way of talking about this that feeds it. I was just talking, in fact, to one of my deacons who is an African American who had a career in law enforcement, just recently retired, talking about the police athletic leagues. What were the police athletic leagues about? They had them in Patterson, they had them in Sacramento, getting cops to do sports with young people with whom they are policing, especially neighborhoods of color, let's say. And I really don't like that terminology. Why? What happens with sports? I just talked to Rafe Kelly talking about the importance of rough and tumble play. If the police and the kids can play sports together and get to know each other, up the resolution on each other, to stop seeing the meaning of a gun before they can see anything else, and to begin to know and develop bonds with each other, the resolution increases and the animosity and ignorance decreases. This was the point of second wave anti-racism. This is the point of my parents raising me in a black community. This is the point of school integration. This is the point, it was much debated, something we don't talk about much now, busing. This is the point of all of those efforts to up the resolution. Now, stereotypes occur, and racism can come out of these anti-racism methods as well. Many people I know grew up racist because they were poorly treated or bullied by members of a different race. Again, these low resolution tags. But the more we racialize our implicit biases, the more trouble we will have down the line. How to address it? I still believe in the practices of second wave anti-racism. And they sound cliche, but the higher the resolution you have with people of different cultural groups, people of different political parties, people of different anything, diversity is a tremendous blessing to have. Because the more human the contact, the higher the resolution, the less the biases play. We will not eradicate individual bias nor group competition. These are foundational elements of our need to manage an incredibly complex world. We can't live without this tool. The best thing we can do is raise the resolution through contact that isn't necessarily focused on the problematic element at the moment. You need to develop love for the stranger, love for the rival, love for the competitor, love for your enemy. Who taught this? The Sunday school answer is correct. It was Jesus. That's why my parents raised me in the place that they did. Why do I believe Christianity addresses racism? Because at the center of the faith is a man dying for his enemies and asking forgiveness of the mob that is mocking him while they kill him. And his enemies said, "This isn't what I was expecting." In a far more racialized world, in a far more dangerous world for Black Americans, this man changed hearts and minds. How? By being a living sacrifice. Wasn't perfectly holy, but by being a living sacrifice, the Black church pricked the conscience of racist America and said, well, at least we can start changing these laws. And his style of racism, judging people by the content of their character, which you need to see close up, high resolution, rather than the color of their skin, de-racialized our biases. Did Dr. King know much cognitive science? No, not a lot was developed then. But the more we know about this, we see meaning before we see people. We see low-resolution cartoons before we see the high resolution of somebody's individual character. So, my parents decided to raise me in a neighborhood that would be, in some respects, a little bit dangerous. And so it was true. As I was walking to cadets one night at one of the neighboring CRC congregations, two black kids came up to me and presented a knife and told me to give them my money. Unfortunately, this person was raised by Stan and Barb, and he didn't have any money. And the kids weren't much for being muggers, but if these were the only black people I knew, what would I map onto black skin? These were not the only black people I knew. The people babysitting me, the people loving me, the people feeding me, the people teaching Sunday school for me, the people in all of their glory and all of their flaws were black. And so when these two individuals came up to rob me at knife point, I didn't associate it with their skin color. Because I knew black folks. I didn't have much of an opportunity to know Korean folks, Chinese folks. We had some in our congregation. Japanese folks. We had some Indonesians because of the Thai. Because here's the thing. There wasn't enough time for me growing up to know everyone, and I lived in a fairly diverse context. But I was formed by what I knew. In Christianity, our leader dies for his enemies. And as one person said, the problem with living sacrifices is that they often crawl off the altar. Well, if you believe in the resurrection, my father spent 36 years of his life loving a community he had to get to know. There were a number of attempted muggings by black people, by drug addicts of my father in the streets of Patterson. He didn't have any money on him either. But neither did it harbor in his mind racism against the black folks or the drug addicts. He spent a lot of time with drug addicts. I spent a lot of time with recovering heroin addicts. That was part of my matrix. Now, many people will not have the privilege that I had growing up in such a church. I grew up at a time and a place when people said it is of a value to worship and share life with people who are different than ourselves. I continue to believe in that value, and I am deeply disturbed by what I see as the re-racializing of much of the implicit biases, which we really can't measure very well. The Harvard people who directed that knew that. So what do? Well, the rider tries to train the elephant away from these biases. And that when you see meaning, okay, I saw meaning. These things are built into me. Let's lower the response. Let's begin to think about this. Oh, what was his name? Was it Bill Pennell? Wrote a book, My Friend the Enemy. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, second wave racism didn't fully address the history or the outcomes. It didn't. There's plenty of work to do. But that doesn't mean all work is the same. Dr. King had his way. Malcolm X had his way. Stokely Carmichael had his way. W.E.D. Du Bois had his way. We work through this thing one person at a time. We fumble our way through, making a lot of problems. When I am asked, are you a racist? I'll say, absolutely. It's part of the sin package in my heart. Now, by the grace of God, in many respects, it is safer to not only be a person in America, but a black person in America than it was in 1950. Praise be to God. Second wave racism bore a number of fruit. How do we make our way forward? Well, I listen to a lot of Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. There are other helpful voices out there. But please don't reseed biases and tribalize these conflicts, because if you think it's disturbing to have black people in the street when a black man is killed by a white cop, how disturbing will it be to have the streets filled with white people, of whom there are more of, when a black cop kills a white man? We don't want to re-racialize this fight. That's my story.